first lecture on the last exam, exam 4. However, we are not losing or missing any of the stuff we covered. We're going to be building, and as you see today, we're going to recycle one of our old concepts, the niche, as well as the idea of modeling, to further advance what we look at. We've talked about individuals for a long time, organisms, because a lot of what biology is what organisms do. But then collectively, what organisms do is interesting to think about at higher levels, like populations. And we started to do that right before the exam. And we're going to continue doing that by thinking about now more than one population at a time, and populations that use the same resources, and how they might compete for those resources and interact with each other's growth. So that's where we're going. But does anyone want to go over this quickly, just to make sure you got, I posted the answers. If you didn't look at it, this is the practice exam. And the reason why I think it's still worth going over is because we're going to use a lot of these concepts today. Again, we're building. We're not forgetting just because it was on exam 3. So let's look at this real quick. The number of whales was more likely estimated by sampling than marker capture. That's false, because whales swim around, right? So remember, when you sample and you put down like a square, if you remember that from the video lecture, you do that for things like plants or like barnacles, things that are attached to the ground that don't move. Because when you lift that square up and go to another place and put it down later and count what's there, you don't want those things that were over here to be moving there, right? So if it's something that moves around quite a bit, you're always going to use mark and recapture. And with whales, if you remember from the video, you can just take a photograph and use identifying features, and a computer can kind of match them up automatically using digital software. Right? So it's kind of like how the FBI determines if they have a picture of you on camera at a crime scene, that it was you from your mugshot. So don't let anyone take your mugshot. Risky. The shrinking population between 1965 and 1970 could have resulted from a decrease in birth rate or an increase in death rate. This is true, and you want to think about the equation. Population changes, births minus deaths plus immigrants minus immigrants. If you see a population increasing or decreasing, it could be a combination of all these factors. So in this case, for this to be true, a decrease in birth rate, increase in death rate, either one of those could cause the population to decline, right? The growing population from 1985 and 1995 could have resulted from decrease in emigration or increase in immigration. Again, for the same reason true, it could be either movement in or movement out, depending on the right proportions, right? Now, for these to also, I could have flip-flopped these, right? And I could have used emigration and immigration up there, and I could use death and birth down there, right? I just would have to change the order, maybe, of increase and decrease to get it true. Between 2005 and 2008, the sum of the birth and immigration rates roughly equal the sum of the death and immigration rates. So let's see what this is saying. Birth and immigration, that's causing the population to increase. Roughly equal death and immigration, that would cause the population to decrease. So if you go and look at that time period, and the population is roughly the same, then that would be true, right? And that must have been the case without looking back at the graph. This is true. The growth of this population would be described well by an exponential model. That's false because the population was doing all kinds of crazy things, right? It was never growing or shrinking. It was always changing, probably according to some process that made the birth rate and the death rate change over time. And the exponential model assumes the birth rate, the death rate doesn't change over time, right? And that the immigration and the emigration rates are equal. Any questions on this model or the logistic population growth model that goes like that? Because those are the ones we're going to build on today. Everybody ready? Oh, you ready? Okay.
I'm good.
Okay. Objective. So we're going to predict the outcome of competition between two species. Like I said, given information about their niches. Now I threw this word fundamental in here, which I've never used before. So what that means is somehow today I'm going to elaborate on this concept of a niche so that you know what I mean by a fundamental niche. And what's special about a fundamental niche as opposed to any other kind of niche? Well, what we're going to do is contrast that niche. And in fact, that's the niche we've always been talking about, the fundamental niche. That is, again, the range of conditions that an organism can tolerate, right? So if I keep them under certain antibiotic conditions with certain kinds of food, how do they do? Do they survive and reproduce or not? And if the population can't grow under these conditions, then it's not within their fundamental niche. So I never used the word fundamental before because I never had to distinguish that niche from any other kind of niche. But today, we're going to do that. So we're going to throw in the fact that this is fundamentally what we're talking about when we say the word niche. But we can talk about another kind of niche called the realized niche. And as you'll see, this is going to be the niche you actually get in reality, right? Hence the realized niche. So more about that as we go. But that's where we're going. All right, so this is where we were. And we're building on these two models of population growth. The one saying that it doesn't matter how big the population grows, the population will always grow per individual at this rate, R. And R is the birth rate per individual minus the death rate per individual. And you worked up with those in recitation last week. So you should be familiar with these values, right? What these parameters mean. Now, we contrasted that last time with the model that went like this, where we said, look, that's a ridiculous assumption to say that birth rates and death rates just stay forever, even when the population grows towards infinity. That makes no sense, right? Even to a small child. So if that's the case, we should somehow want to change this model and make it more realistic. And we said we can do that by building a simple assumption that this value of R, birth rate minus death rate, gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the population grows. And we'll make it linear because that makes the math really easy. And in the video that's on Blackboard, you can follow the math. Simple 8th grade algebra or 9th grade algebra, you can follow how you go from this model to that model with just making this line. And if that's the case then, the population is not necessarily growing at R all the time. It's growing at some modification of R based on how close the population size is to the carrying capacity, right? Okay, that's where we've been. Everybody good with that? Because what we want to do now is we want to build on that one step further. Because this is all competition within a species. Individuals of the same species, all with the same fundamental niche, interacting with each other to use the same resources. We want to now add a second species that may not have the same fundamental niche, but may have enough overlap in their fundamental niche that they still compete for some of those resources. So any questions on this one? All right, well then let me ask you a question and debut the clickers, which are supposed to be working now. Let me have a look and see if the polls are open. The polling is open. I got a response. Very exciting. So this question is for the logistic population growth model, right? For that model with K in it, with the carrying capacity, a population initially grows at a rate equal to R and then grows slower thereafter. True or false?
Nearly equal to R. So fundamental is like what you can work in. Realized is like what you actually do. So it's much, much sooner.
30 seconds.
That's what it is. Yeah, that's what it is. That's much, much sooner. So it's like, well, it's like I could live in Phoenix. But I'm thinking true. But I'm trying to think if there's any way to.
10 seconds.
But this is a trick question. I mean, the growth rate can still increase.
4,
right?
3,
so
2,
maybe
1.
Maybe it's false.
Obviously, I think I have to hit this button.
But I'm
For some reason, my clicker doesn't make this work.
growth rate per individual. So.
All right, controversy. We have 78% of the class say true, 22% saying false. What did I whisper to you while they were all answering? I said they're all going to get it wrong. I was wrong. Only 78% of you got it wrong. Turn to your partner and now think critically about this model. Why is it false?
Oh, it's also not equal to R because you're multiplying by n. Yeah, so then it would be the growth rate per individual versus the growth rate of the population. This is asking for the growth rate of the population, not the individual. So it's more right? That's why it's false, I think. Maybe. We'll see. What do you think?
I mean, I picked false. That was primarily on intuition.
Do you want 30? Anyone want 30 more seconds?
The rate doesn't really change.
No?
But what is dn1 over dt? What is that a rate? Is that the thing we got R never changed.
Raise your hand when you know why it's false. I want to see 10 hands up before I move on. Raise your hand when you know why it's false. I got 3 hands. Who else? 4. Anybody else know why it's false? 5, 6, 7, 8. 2 more? No? I know more than 8 people answered false the first time because there were 100 some people in the class. So if you know why it's false, raise your hand high. Okay. What I want is, what's your name in the back? I don't see any name tags either. You guys are terrible at just doing something every day. If you have a name tag, put it up. Yeah. Oh, why is it false? Yeah. Wait, so you're saying the growth rates always are? Okay, but we're talking about this model here. So the growth rate is changing, right, as the population size increases. So does anyone else want to give me the reason name? Who else had their hand up? I saw. Oh, here we go.
Well, if you look at the lines, it's at a steady rate the whole time.
So you're saying because the line increases at a single rate, but is that the population growth rate, or is that the rate of change of the population growth rate?
Rate of change.
That's the rate of change. This is the population growth rate, the value on this axis. So that growth rate's decreasing with time. But why is it false? This is about actually critically looking at a model and thinking about what it says, literally. Yes? And what's the smallest size we could have for a population? 1. There is no population that is 0. If there is, we wouldn't be talking about it because it can't grow. So the smallest population size you can put in here is 1. And k minus 1 is going to be less than k, which means that this is going to multiply by r, this is going to be a fraction that's less than 1. You have to, if you're going to be successful in science, and this is not a criticism, because everyone starts out this way. You trust the math, and you just like blindly read what somebody says and say, oh, okay. But you have to look at it and say for yourself, what does it really say? What it really says is the population never grows at a rate equal to r, because there can be no such population. A population always grows at a rate less than r, and that rate decreases thereafter. And the reason why it's important to get into this habit is because sometimes people will try to pull the wool over your eyes with equations. And you just go into like math at home and you're like, okay, you're right, I believe you because you used math. But in reality, the math should make sense. In this case, if I were to say the population grows at the rate of r, you should say, no, Mike, it never grows at the rate of r. Because the only population would do that would be the ones that don't exist. All right? So, at that level of understanding, if we feel comfortable about the equation, then we can move on and build on it. But until we get to that level, where we can like look at it, we can plug values in, we can think about what that means biologically, it's hard to then build on that. Because when we build on that, you're just kind of like building on something you don't really understand. Okay, so does anyone ask me any other questions about this model? Because now we're going to build on it. So if you understand now that this population will never grow at a rate of r, the question is, can we make it grow even slower than that because of competition with another species? So if we're always going to basically devalue r by this thing right here, can we take one step further and devalue r from the very beginning? Not because of how many individuals are in this population, but because of how many individuals are in a whole other population out there that you don't know about, your competitors, right? It could be one species, it could be a giant bag of individuals of all species, however you want to think about it. But it's another population, another group of individuals that have similar resource requirements because their niches overlap in some way. And what that means is you won't even, at a population size of 1, grow anywhere close to r, because your birth rates and your death rates are affected by competition with that other species. So what happens when we modify this equation is that from the very beginning, the intercept goes down because of the other species. In fact, the intercept goes down by a very specific amount. It goes down by this amount right here, which is the individuals of a second species. Not you, but any other species that has a similar niche, and some value alpha. And that, if you remember from the video, that value alpha is simply a conversion factor. It's a way of saying, hey, if I got this other species out there, how do I convert that to the equivalent of my species? I'll give you an example. Take chimpanzees, right? Chimpanzees are our closest living relative. We compete with chimpanzees for at least one thing, space, right? And why are they endangered? Well, just because we take all their space, right? We also do things like shoot them for crazy reasons. We do all kinds of stuff. But let's take the one issue, space, right? Let's say we're competing for space. Now, you can't have a city with chimpanzees living happily in it, running around in the vegetation, eating the foliage, right? And you can't have that and a city. So if we were to ask ourselves, what's the impact of having chimpanzees on the planet, it's going to be how many of them are there and how much space do they need? But also, you can imagine a chimpanzee may not take up the exact amount of space as a human. So we would have to translate their space requirements to what it's like to be a human, right? So let's say they take up less space, just for sake of argument, right? In that case, if they take up less space per chimpanzee, we would have to say, okay, having 10 chimpanzees is not like having 10 humans. It's like having less than 10 humans. And so we're going to multiply the number of chimpanzees by some fraction, which is less than 1. Right? So having a chimpanzee requires half the space of a human. What would this alpha value be? Should be thinking in your head 0.5, right? If you're not thinking 0.5, then you're not following the reasoning. We want to scale the number of those chimpanzees down to the equivalent number of humans. Right now, if, let's say, and it's possible, because we can live in little apartments and condos quite happily, but chimps have to range and eat natural vegetation. They don't have grocery stores, they don't have all kinds of other systems to compress their population down into a tiny space. What if chimpanzees need 5 times the amount of space of a human per chimpanzee? In which case, that value could be more than 1. It could be 5. And having other chimpanzees around is actually potentially really bad for people. In fact, it might be worse for people than it is for chimpanzees, right? When we go and say, what's our effect on chimpanzees? So there's no reason this value has to be small or it can be large. It could be anything. Now, here's a quick question. What happens if the value is 1? What does it mean? Andrew?
They use the same amount of resources.
Okay, so what does it mean about the fundamental niche of the two species?
They're the same. Oh, sorry.
It potentially means it's the same. Or it could also mean that it's really not exactly the same, but that they need a lot of certain resources, right? So in other words, it could be like almost the same, but they need more of the resources than we do per individual. So actually it could mean several different things. But what it really means mathematically is that 1 chimp is equal to 1 human in terms of decreasing resources, right? That they need to grow. So again, now it's a very simple way, it's just a simple mathematical change. And then what it also means is that that population of humans, in this example, will never grow to its carrying capacity. It will always grow to a carrying capacity that's been adjusted by the presence of the other species and how strongly they interact. Okay, so that's what we're doing today, is we're thinking about this model as a starting point and then building this model on top of it. Now, if we wanted to talk about 2 species, we need an equation for each species. Because as humans grow, like chimps change too. They may go down, they may go up, but as they're changing, we have to constantly adjust how many of them there are competing with how many of us, right? Now keep in mind, you could use this for any population. Don't use this for chimps and humans. I'm just trying to keep an example that might be easy to think about. In this case, we might imagine that in that equation with the alpha, that was the effect of chimps on humans. But now we might actually say, how about the growth of the chimpanzee population? Well, they have their own R, their own birth and death rates. They have their own population size, hence the little 2 down here, right? The subscript just means that we're talking about the things for that population. They have their own K, and they are affected by competition by us. So that beta is simply to keep it separate from alpha. It's the conversion factor for how we affect chimpanzee population growth. Are we equivalent to 1 chimpanzee? Are we equivalent to half a chimpanzee? Are we equivalent to 5 chimpanzees, right, in terms of resource consumption? That's what this model is saying. So you'll have 2 equations like this. So let's try a question, and you should be able to actually answer this just from the pre-class video. So take a shot. Competing species are more likely to coexist, meaning they both can survive indefinitely in a place, if their growth rates R1 and R2 increase. True or false?
Oh, wait a minute.
Make sure the clickers are still working. Still working. Awesome. Mysteriously working, and I did nothing to fix it.
It's not going to affect anything, actually. I don't think. No, it would. Well, it depends on if they're increasing at the same rate or not.
Okay, 30 seconds. Sorry, I meant to say 10 seconds. 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, I know how to make it come up. No, I did too many clicks. Oh, jeez. There we go. 100% say false. Competing species are more likely to coexist. Was that really true? Or was that a mistake? Was it 100% the first time?
I think
It was like 90-something% false
For
a brief second.
Okay, so most of you said false. What I'd like you to do is turn to your partner and discuss your reasoning for 30 seconds. And then I'm telling you now that I'm going to call on a random person. So really discuss your reasoning and be prepared to tell me you or your partner's reasoning. You can blame it on your partner if you want. Go.
What do you think?
if their growth rates increase, competing species are more likely to coexist because of its increase. If those growth rates are increasing, that means that they're competing more, are more likely to coexist. If they're competing more, but when the growth rate decreases at some point, if they compete more.
Okay, 10 seconds.
What do you think?
So, basically,
Okay, I got Eric here. I'm gonna ask
yeah,
Eric.
there's going to be a larger amount of the species, so it's going to put more pressure on the other side because your end's
That's
going to
what
be
I'm
bigger
thinking.
in the end.
So you said false because if both species are increasing, they're going to increase. They're going to compete more for resources if they're both
Yeah,
increasing.
even if they're the same.
Does anyone else have similar reasoning?
There's
Raise your hand.
what is it, like a
Okay, so you're not alone, Eric. That's all right. Well, let me ask you a question.
sine and cosine
Does that make sense?
together.
Is anyone asking, is R1 and R2 really how fast they're increasing?
Steepness of it's going to depend.
Let's go back to that model. Are they ever growing at R? No, they're not, ever. They weren't growing at R when there were one species, and they're never growing at R, for sure, when there's two species. So what does R really tell you? Precisely what does R say? What's the growth rate R mean for a species? Yes, Cooper. It's the rate when there's no population. It's the rate at which they're growing when there's absolutely, and it's approximately the rate they're growing at when there's one individual. It's really close to R when there's one individual. But does that tell you the rate at which they're growing in the end? So actually it's false, but it's not false for that reason. Now think of, and this is why I had to cross that out. Wouldn't it suck if we actually graded for reasoning? You'd actually get some of those ones you got right wrong if we checked your reasoning. Now, what I want to know is, does anyone have a different reasoning? Austin.
Well, as both species grow, they're going to be competing more, and in turn, their birth rates and death rates, they're going to be at odds. So, unless the carrying capacity increases, then, well, then you would. Yeah, I kind of got stuck with that.
Okay, let me ask you this. Think about us and chimpanzees again, right? Chimpanzees. It's like Planet of the Apes. Imagine that were a real thing. What would you want, if they compete with you, what would you want to be sure was true? Like, what's the one parameter in that equation for chimpanzees that you would want to be the smallest possible? What sets the upper bound that you know there can never be more chimpanzees competing with you than that? What's the one parameter in that equation? Well, what's the parameter that determines the upper bound of humans? We talked about it all last recitation.
K.
K. So it's the carrying capacity of chimpanzees that we really want to worry about relative to the carrying capacity of humans. It's not the rate at which they would never fictitiously grow because there can't be 0 individuals. It's not even the rate at which they grow when there aren't that many of them. It's how many there could be one day. It doesn't matter how fast they get to that point, they're going to get there eventually. And for us to compete with them and still be able to survive in that environment, they have to be limited by something else besides the resources that we need that keeps their K so low that they actually don't outcompete us. And the same thing, if I were chimpanzees and I was like in the Planet of the Apes and I was thinking, what do we do about those humans? I'd be like, well, we got to hope that their carrying capacity is low because they are limited by some other resources that we don't need so that they never get to the point that they consume too many of the resources we need. In other words, what we're saying is we got to hope that we have different enough fundamental niches that we need different resources such that each of our populations can't grow to the point where we compete too much for the same resource. Does that make sense in words? Because that's really what the math is saying here, is that we are hoping that we don't have identical fundamental niches, because if we did, we'd have the same carrying capacity, and if we did, we would definitely face an equal number of competitors at some point, because they can grow just as well as we can, to as large a size as we can. Right? And perhaps use similar resources. So that's really what we're talking about. And if you remember, on the video, there's a mathematical solution to this, which I wouldn't ask you to do, but a guy did this. Basically, the guy named Gauss solved this and said, look, what it comes down to is all about carrying capacities and how competitive they are. The more competitive they are, like the more chimpanzees compete with us, the fewer chimpanzees we can let have on this planet. And they're saying the same thing, if they're smart. The more humans compete with us, the fewer humans, of course they've already lost, the fewer humans we can have on this planet, right? And what it really then comes down to is some condition. Both of these have to be true. If one of these isn't true, then one of those species is going extinct. It has to be that the effect of one species on the other is less than the ratio of those individuals. So you don't want so many of those individuals around so they can outcompete you. So let's go back and look at what those alphas and k's assigned to. Here is alpha and the effect of the second species. So let's have a look at this. Alpha and the effect of the second species. What we're saying is if we rearrange this, is that, man, we can't have too much competition from chimpanzees. And that's based on the number of chimpanzees, and it's based on the impact of each one. If that is really high, compared to how many humans we can have, we're not going to make it. And the same thing's true from the chimpanzee perspective. If, man, humans are like really competitive in terms of chimpanzee competition, and there's a lot of them, and if this value is more than the number of chimpanzees the environment can sustain, we're not going to make it, right? It's all about the resources that are out there, in other words, the carrying capacity for each population, and the amount of overlap in the need for those resources, and that's what alpha and beta tell you. Yes?
So if it's all about carrying capacities, how can we answer the previous question?
The question is false. It has nothing to do with R.
Right.
Mathematically, it has nothing to do with R. That's how you can answer it. So in other words, you don't see R anywhere here, which means it absolutely has no bearing on the issue. Because R is just the mythical rate at which a population at zero size grows, right? Remember? From the first question. So it tells you about how populations grow initially, but what's really important is when populations stop growing and how big they are. That's what's going to determine the competition you can expect to see from another species. Because that population can grow really quickly at first, but then stop at a small size. Or it can grow really slowly and ultimately reach a large size. What's important in the long run is what size it's going to reach. And that's K. And how competitive it is. And that's alpha or beta, depending on the species you're talking about. So does that make some sense? Does anyone want a different way of explaining it or thinking about it? Everyone's happy? For now, at least? Okay, let's, then, I just added these words here, which might help you to think about it. Basically what you're saying is you want species 2 to limit itself more. You want this species to limit itself more than the other species limit, is it? And you want it to also be true for the other species. Each species has to limit itself by having a low K to the point where it never gets abundant enough that they compete and outcompete each other. All right, now let's take a look at a case study then. And what I want to do with this case study is show you how powerful mathematical models can be. Because we wouldn't have built up to this mathematical model over like 2 days if it wasn't going to be something that I could say, there's a purpose for having the math. In other words, we can make a quantitative, precise prediction, and we can experimentally show that under those conditions, we can predict which population is going to go extinct and which is going to survive. And what I will argue is that if the math doesn't do that, what's the point of having the math? We might as well stick with words, right? Because the math is only valuable and worth the time if it allows us to make predictions that our brains wouldn't have been able to make without the math. So let's talk about 2 species. Now, of course, we're not going to talk about chimpanzees and humans, so that would make an awesome reality show. We're going to talk about Paramecia and Colpidium, which are 2 little single-celled protozoans. And you can grow populations of these things in little flasks. So imagine now, this experiment would have lots of populations, some with one species, some with both species, and you could ask yourself how the populations grow. And from these kinds of experiments, you could actually estimate things like growth rates when the population is low, or little r. You can actually estimate things like the carrying capacity of each species on its own in a particular experimental environment. Remember, carrying capacity depends on the environment, so what's the carrying capacity for a flask, basically, is what you're asking. And what this researcher did, Lin Zhang, is he actually did this for both species. He measured growth rates and he measured carrying capacities over a range of temperatures. And as we've been talking about, temperature affects metabolism, growth, development, survival. And so we'd imagine that these things are affected by temperature to some degree. And we can see that in this species, they grow the fastest when they're at low densities, that is little r is the highest, when they're at low temperature. But in the other species, it's the exact opposite. So we have like crisscrossing lines here. If you look at the carrying capacity, you can see that one species has a higher carrying capacity at low temperature and it decreases, whereas the other species, I would describe that as relatively flat, right? So one species really depends on temperature, the other one doesn't. Now, you just told me one slide ago, whether you got the reasoning right or not, that I shouldn't give a shit about this. So let's just forget this, right? It's measured. You need it for the model to make predictions. But it shouldn't now affect our thoughts about whether they can coexist or not, right? You have to plug it into the model to get any predictions, but we don't need to think about it to say, in what temperature would we expect these 2 species to coexist? What do we need instead of R now in order to do that? If we had K for each species, what do we need now? Oh, I thought you were raising your hand in the back. Just got your hands. R? Well, we don't need R. Remember, R we don't need. We need the alpha and the beta, right? So let me give you one of these. I'm going to give you the effect of Colpidium on Paramecium. Let's call it alpha, right? We haven't had an alpha or a beta yet. So we can define that effect as either alpha or beta. Let's just stick with alpha. So now I'm going to give you this, and I want to know if I give you this information about how the temperature affects the competition of Colpidium on alpha, biologically, take 30 seconds to talk to your neighbor. What does that mean in words? As temperature goes up, blah, 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 blah. What would you say biologically from that information? Okay, take 30 seconds. It could get loud. Take a minute if you want. TAs need some exercise, especially Doug. Doug, let's walk around.
What do you think?
It goes up, alpha is going to go up, so alpha goes up, the possibility that the coexisting decreases.
What do you think?
You can't extrapolate with this, but if you increase it enough, they might reach to a point where you cannot make them coexist with each other. Yeah.
Like the Colpidium is going to basically fuck up. Is the opposite true then?
Temperature increases,
So that's
effective
like, if it's
competition,
like 22, but
likewise
low,
increases,
does that mean your Paramecium's gonna
effective competition is alpha. Alpha meaning what do you think?
Well, that's pretty much what I think. I mean, as the temperature goes up, the competition for resources go up, whether that be space or food. Or it doesn't seem as though there's much competition for food, though, because there's very low competition at 22 degrees Celsius. So it's most likely space or something along those lines.
Yeah, I agree.
So this would also mean that the ability to coexist decreases at higher temperatures because you have a larger alpha.
Okay, 10 seconds.
Those are my thoughts.
So what does this mean in words? I theoretically should be able to call in anyone, including the dude in the yellow shirt behind the dude in the striped shirt with the laptop open. That's right, you're looking to the right. What's your name? Yes. Mark, what do you think? In words. As the temperature goes up, blah, 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 blah.
As the temperature goes up, competition, the effect of competition also goes up.
Well, what affected competition? I'm looking for a very precise statement about how you think about competition. Yes? As you said, as the temperature goes up, Ophidian negatively affects paramecium more? Is that what you said? I thought that's what I heard.
Yeah, it's just like us.
When I say it back to you, it's weird. Okay, and how much more, actually? I mean, in a sense, these numbers mean something, right? So, like, you could even say, did anyone say, as the temperature goes up, it goes from, like, one copinion being, like, 1/10 of a paramecium to being, like, half of a paramecium? Because that's what the numbers mean, right? So now, like, it's 6 times as competitive, which means you don't need 10 copinion to equal 1 paramecium. Now you only need 2 copinion to equal 1 paramecium. You can literally say that from the data. So does everyone follow that, how we can apply that? So now, if that's true, and if these numbers are valid, I can ask you questions like, what if we were to do the following? What if we were to compete these two now? Those are all data that I give you, and I'm going to give you now, at 3 temperatures, I'm going to summarize the data. I'm going to give you the fact that the K for copinium goes like this. The alpha, as you just saw, goes like this, the effect of copinium on paramecium. And what I'm going to then give you also is the fact that we know that the K for paramecium is constant, right? It was the one that was flat across temperatures. So it doesn't change. And now I'm giving you all the values you need for 3 temperatures. And I want you to take 2 to 3, maybe even 4 minutes, because I want you to calculate at each temperature, using the conditions for the survival of paramecium. Can it survive? Is the ratio, or better yet, is alpha times K less than K? So you need to figure out which K do I put on the right side, which K on the left side, and plug all these values in. Yeah, super question.
Yeah, if it's an inequality, how does K2 decrease when alpha increases, or is
When I say it's increasing, I mean over temperature. So there's 3 temperatures. Remember, alpha's increasing. For one species, K is flat. So that's for paramecium. For the other species, K tends to decrease. And so now all I've done is put those numbers on a graph. And I asked you to just pick these 3 temperatures, the 2 extremes in the middle, and plug the values into that function and ask, given that model, what would you predict to happen if I competed them? Is that? Okay. Okay, so now you should be calculating. CAs are going to walk around, because I suspect there might be some hands going up at some point.
I don't remember who K2 and alpha is for, is the issue. I don't know who K2 and alpha are for. So does alpha go with, is alpha the effect of K1 on K2, or is alpha the effect of K2 on K1? That's, I, we,
I'm gonna say
I need to know that.
I mean, of the first population on the second population is very first population has a smaller effect on the second population carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is higher. Carrying capacity decreases as the effect of the first population on it. That's not bad. K2 carries
I don't know, that's what I'm thinking, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
I think paramecium is not a competitor. And so the competitor decreases as temperature increases. Paramecium might divide the same. K1 is at 10,000.
So, I mean, I assume that alpha will be paired with K2, so that's
You want to go to this
pressure
slide that
K2
has
and
the inequality and
K1,
use
and
the
you
top
multiply the
inequality.
two.
Right? Alpha
So then you
times
get these
K2
conditions.
has to be less than K1. That'll get you started. And you have to do that for every temperature. And as
Meaning that,
it's true or not.
what it would be. K1 would win at the, or wait, no. Oh yeah, no, I don't know. I think I need to divide.
Okay, another minute. How many people want another minute or just 30 seconds? Raise your hand if you want another full minute. Okay.
Is alpha the effect of K1 on K2 or K2 on K1?
Let's see. Okay, 30 seconds.
I'm not sure, quite honest.
That's what I'm trying to figure out, because you don't know if you're supposed to
Okay,
multiply or
I'm
divide.
not looking for numbers here. I'm looking for at what temperature do you expect paramecium to be able to coexist with colpidium? So raise your hand if you think you're absolutely sure. First of all, here's what I want to do it, because I don't have a quick question for this. How many people think that there's 3 temperatures at which they should be able to coexist? Raise your hand. How many people think there's 2 temperatures they should be able to coexist at?
2 or 1.
How many people think there's only 1 temperature they should be able to coexist at? Oh, this is great. All right, so now what I'd like to do is tell you that there's 2 temperatures that should coexist at. And I want somebody who's got that to tell me the reasoning. Anyone? Do we want to get from Austin? All right. Well, go ahead. Oh, we got a new case. No offense, Austin. I'm trying to involve new people. Go ahead.
Well, when you multiply K2 times alpha, you'll notice that for 100,000 times 0.08 is 8,000. However, for 90,000 and 0.17, you get a value above K1. And for 0.45 and 10,000, you get a value below K1.
Okay, so you're saying if the multiplication of these 2 values is below that, they should be able to coexist, right? And most people got to that conclusion. So try this true false, because I didn't say, she said the temperature. Maybe you didn't hear it. Now you can enter it for fun. I'll give you 30 seconds.
Could be on the left and right. Where the multiplication is less than 10,000. But in the intermediate temperature, you get value of 15,000, which is quite a bit more than 10,000.
All right, 10 seconds. Five, four, three, two, one. Okay, so it's false 80% and true 20%. Okay, what I want to do is I want someone who put true to explain to me their reasoning so I can help like troubleshoot the reasoning. Anyone who wants to put true, want to volunteer the reasoning. Don't feel embarrassed. It's okay. I don't know what the reasoning was if you don't tell me. Then you guys, how many people would like to discuss the reasoning with neighbors so they don't have to say it out loud? Raise your hand. Okay, let's do that. Take 30 seconds to 60 seconds, discuss your reasoning with your neighbor, and then you can always offer me the reasoning that your neighbor gave you, right? Blame them for saying it.
Oh, I did the math on higher temperatures.
I mean, you might have figured that well, after determining it was 2, there was only one possibility that would lead us to that conclusion. However, if you looked at dividing it, for instance, or like dividing it by the other side, you would get an alternative answer, I think. Or if you switch if you assume that when dividing you had to switch the greater than, less than sign, you also have to do that. But I think that's only the case with negative numbers, I don't know.
10 seconds. Okay, did anyone use incorrect reasoning? Well, put it this way. Did your neighbor use incorrect reasoning that wasn't simply a mathematical calculation error? Because I get those happen, right? But did anyone totally use the wrong formula? Didn't interpret the outcome the right way, even though you got the math right? Anyone want to resolve it? Or you guys resolved it all? You resolved it all in discussion? It's your chance. Okay? It should be that if you do the math, you find out, as she said, that this is where the inequality doesn't hold. Now that's, biologically, if we want to think about it, we could look at it like this. The thing is, there may be an awful lot of copinium hanging around at low temperature, but each one isn't that competitive, right? So at that temperature, their resource needs aren't as overlapping with paramecium as they are at other temperatures. So it's like, yeah, there's a lot of them, but they're all like not that big a deal to worry about. Here, at high temperatures, they're very competitive, but there's not that many of them again, right? So it flip-flops. And so the product of these two is small enough that it's manageable for paramecium to persist. But in the middle, there's a sufficient number of copinium, and they're sufficiently competitive such that the product of those two should, and I say should because this is a mathematical model, right? We predict that they should outcompete paramecium. Question is, what really happens? Here's the experiment done by the investigators. I want you to write a figure legend. It was a competition experiment where they looked at the density of the populations of both species over time in days at 3 temperatures. So obviously 3 different treatments in the experiment. And TAs can walk around with me and troubleshoot, figure legend writing.
I would say that the first one, but the both persistent. The second one, paramecium to be persistent, but then copinium to persist. Whereas the third one, paramecium against outcompete copinium.
Look at this.
Do you always go to redemption? Last couple months.
Some of them agree on quite a while, which is like, it's like a long way.
How were you always
22 degrees Celsius, paramecium sharply increased, and populations of both species seem to remain steady. Population of colpidium seems to be steady at 26 degrees Celsius, but the population of paramecium, after increasing, becomes extinct shortly after, and at 30 degrees Celsius, they both seem fairly steady, though the paramecium overtakes the population of colpidium.
If you're chatting, you must be done writing your feeder legend.
With the paramecium having a constant population and the colpidium slightly declining.
So it's like you like outdoors and stuff. Like you can't go fishing.
It seems as though when the colpidium population went down slightly, the paramecium population was able to go up slightly.
Seconds. All right, so I gave you guys in the middle there 30 more seconds because you asked for it, so you must have a figure legend. Do you want to share it with me? What's your name? Yeah, either of you, both your group.
Okay, my name's Nicole. So I wrote
So Nicole wrote.
at 22 degrees Celsius, the colpidium and the paramecium both persist. At 22 degrees Celsius, the colpidium accompanies the paramecium, which go extinct. And then I didn't finish, but
Okay, so you wrote it at what was the first one? At 26 degrees?
at 22.
At 22 degrees Celsius, the colpidium and paramecium coexist. At 26 degrees, paramecium goes extinct. And then you didn't finish.
Yeah.
Right? So, did anyone do a very linear, so that's what I would like to say, a linear figure legend, right? It's walking you from left to right what's happening on the panels. And some people, when they do that, they'll put, literally, they'll label panels A, B, and C. And they'll be like, panel A, at 22 degrees. Panel B, at this, panel C, right? So did anyone have a more synthetic one that didn't talk about each panel, but collectively talked about all the panels? And there's no right or wrong, it's just different styles. As long as you convey the information. Did anyone have like one big summary in a sentence or two that wasn't panel by panel? Cooper.
Intermediate temperatures drive competition up and drive species or paramecium extinction.
So you just focused on one panel and you presume everything else is the opposite of that. Intermediate temperatures, increased competition. I would maybe reword it, say like intermediate temperatures. Actually, in reality, do you know? You have to presume they're competing, right? So all you really could say is intermediate temperatures cause paramecium to go extinct, right? And then it's implied that at the other temperature, they don't go extinct. And actually, I would say the intermediate temperature, because there was only one, right? So the shortest possible figure legend you can have is, you know, the intermediate temperature, and then maybe 26 degrees in parentheses, cause paramecium to go extinct. And if you want to add when competing with colpidium, that's fine, right? That's the shortest possible figure legend you can have. It says everything that you need to know. It implies that it didn't happen at the other temperatures. But you could also have panel A, panel B, panel C. And you see these kinds of figure legends. You see both of these in different papers. Now, did everyone agree, though, that if you look, here's 0. So that's why it went extinct. 0, this is one of these weird figures where 0 is at the bottom, right? And that's just usually the case because if these points were on the bottom, they'd be harder to see. So people sometimes offset them so they're easier to see. I don't like doing that myself. I just make bigger points. But this is the style you sometimes see. So if you were fooled by that, you might have thought, well, they're still around at low density. But in reality, they did go extinct. So we can use this model. This is a model, and I gave you the actual values from the paper. That's the numbers I gave you. I looked them up in the paper. And they were collected with experiments that were not the last experiment that you just wrote a figure legend for. So somebody went out and measured the parameters of this model, and then predicted this would happen. And then as you told me, it happened. That's the power of mathematical models. Good mathematical models allowed you to make a prediction that you couldn't have made before you came to class today. Now, of course, it's even better if you know how to build the models in the first place, right, and do the measurement. But you can see that if you can do that stuff, this is why, by the way, anybody an engineer here happen to be in here for some weird reason? No? So if I ran at 182 and you guys were mixed in with other things, they would be like engineers, computer scientists. They are taking a boatload of math because they are always building mathematical models. Because if that O-ring is off by a little bit, somebody can blow up, right? They want to make very, very specific predictions because getting the right answer is a matter of life and death. Especially if you're building amusement park rides or all kinds of other things. Now, for biologists, many of us get away with not having mathematical models because honestly, no one's holding us accountable for the predictions that we make. It's not because we're better not doing it, it's because no one cares a lot of times about the predictions we make. But when you use a mathematical model, you can always make more precise predictions. And a good model can be incredibly powerful. So this also enables us to develop a new concept today, which we're going to call the realized niche. The idea is that if we look at the fundamental niche of this paramecium species, it's across this whole range. On its own, in the lab, it can survive all these temperatures. But if we were to see it out there in nature, and this other species happen to be present, we would find that its realized niche, where it actually gets to live, is only at low temperatures and high temperatures. And we wouldn't expect to see it at intermediate temperatures. And so what we'll see is that when we go out in nature and look at where things live, we can't necessarily assume that's their fundamental niche. We might find that where they live is just a fraction of the abiotic conditions they can actually tolerate. Because not only are they competing with other species, they have predators, they have mutualists, right, things that help them. They've got all kinds of other species out there, parasites, that have negative or positive effects on them. So maybe a good thought question to think about as you go home and come back for next time is, can it ever be the case that the realized niche is larger than the fundamental niche? Right? We know it can be different, and in this case it's smaller. But you should think about this. And at the next class I'm going to ask at the beginning, like, did you have any thoughts, profound thoughts on this? In the meantime, the practice exam is competing critters. And it's about two species. Hold on, we need like a few minutes of explanation. About two species of lizards that live in this place in Big Bend National Park. This is a really awesome place. And one species of lizard you can actually find in your backyard. It's a tree lizard. So it's widely found throughout the Southwest. So I have them in my backyard. I'm sure you have them somewhere near your backyard. But another species of lizard is the canyon lizard. It's only found in this area of Big Bend National Park in Texas. And what they do in the experiment is they remove one species and ask what happens to the other species. And from that experiment, they want to infer whether or not competition was going on between the two species. So that's the setup, and I'll hang around if you guys want to do it in class and have questions, and the TAs will be here as well.
Alrighty.
Let's do it.